Morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the ADAS folpet modelling data. Today, we're going to hear from two speakers. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Michael Grimmer, who's Principal Consultant in Crop Disease Management at ADAS Boxworth. Mike's going to present to us the latest modelling data, showing how the multi-site fungicide folpet can benefit resistance management in your programmes. And then we're going to hand over and hear from ADAMA's fungicide technical specialist, Andy Bailey. Andy's going to give a brief overview of Arizona use recommendations, particularly in the context of the challenging season that we're facing this year. So presentations should last around 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time at the end for a question and answer session. There is a basis point available for the webinar, so we'll share details with that at the end of the session. So I'll hand over now to Mike and we'll get going. Thanks, Mike.
Lovely, thank you, Mel. Right, so good morning, everyone. I'd like to tell you about a recent project we've had with ADAMA, and that's looking at modelling the benefits of folpet to manage resistance. So the aim of this work was to assess the usefulness of folpet as a mixing partner in septoria application programs with one or two single site acting fungicides of different mode of action. So of course, single site fungicides we associate with being prone to resistance development, whereas folpet as a multi-site fungicide has much lower resistance risk. So the deliverables of this work were to gather evidence of the benefits of folpet at reducing selection for resistance to azole and or SDHI containing application programs, and to quantify the effect of folpet on resistance development. So the program of work then was to generate a model, which was based on existing modeling work, and then to fit that model to real life data, and then to run the model to explore different scenarios and different doses, and then use the model to generate results for those scenarios and doses. And we looked at two main treatment programs. So the first, the top right table, relevant to the UK, where at T1 and T2 spray timings, we had full rates of methen trifluconazole and fluxapyroxad, so at the same rates as in Revistar. So that's the azole and the SDHI. And then just below that, a different treatment program we looked at relevant to the EU as well as the UK, because in some countries in the EU, they're only allowed one SDHI spray per season. So in this case, we had methen full rate at T1, methen plus fluxa at the full Revistar rate at T2. So we looked at these treatment programs and how long it took for resistance to develop. And then we looked at what happened when we introduced folpet into this spray program. And we explained the effect of folpet in these programs and the beneficial impact it has on resistance development. So this slide shows the structure of the model. So essentially it's modeling canopy growth during the season. So the increase in greenleaf area and then the decrease in greenleaf area through senescence, and also with part of that greenleaf area being taken up by septoria infection. So the infection starts with the arrival of inoculum, and then it goes through a latent period where there's no visible disease symptoms, and then an infectious period where we start to see the disease symptoms as spores are being released to infect new green tissue. And this cycles throughout the season and generates an epidemic. And then towards the end of the season, there's sexual reproduction, and this results in release of ascospores, which provides the initial inoculum for reinfection the following autumn and winter. And here we're just looking at an example model run. So on the x-axis, we're looking at time, and it's broken down by season. And on the y-axis is the leaf area index of wheat, which changes through the season. And as you can see, each season we have a sensitive strain in blue of septoria, and each season we have an epidemic, and this increases and declines. And then over time, over seasons, we start to see the emergence of a resistant strain. And with fungicide use, this builds and builds, so that by season 5 here, what you can see is that the resistant strain has essentially taken over the pathogen population. And because it's resistant, the fungicide sprays are no longer having effective disease control. So the amount of leaf area that's taken up by disease has increased. So we've lost effective control. So the important parameter we're interested in here is the effective life, and this is the time between introduction of a fungicide and the moment when effective control is lost. Okay, so an important component of the modelling work are dose response curves for the different fungicides in our treatment programs. And here you can see the different fungicides we looked at earlier. So there's folpet, multi-site fungicide, and then the 2 single-site fungicides, fluxapyroxad, the SDHI, and then methane trifluconazole, the azole. And if you're familiar with AHDB fungicide performance work, then you'll be familiar with these kinds of dose response curves. So on the x-axis is an increasing dose of each fungicide, and then on the y-axis is the severity of disease, which decreases as we increase the dose. So along the top panel are dose response curves for sensitive strains after these products were introduced onto the market, after these AIs, and then through time with single-site fungicides, we know that resistance can develop. So for fluxapyroxad, we looked at, for the resistant isolates, we looked at fungicide performance data over the last few years, where we know that insensitive strains have emerged in the septoria population. And for methane trifluconazole, it's only recently been introduced on the market. So we've used a hypothetical dose response curve along the lines of where we've seen resistance to azoles in the past. Okay, so this is going back to our treatment programs. If you remember, there was one relevant to the UK where we have methane plus fluxa at T1 and T2, and then one relevant to the UK and the EU where we just have methane at T1 and methane plus fluxa at T2. And here we've taken a very low initial frequency of resistance, so kind of frequency we might expect soon after AIs are introduced onto the market. And on the top panel, what we're looking at is we basically explored the dose of methane plus fluxa at T1 and also at T2, and looking at the effect that those different doses have on the effective life of that single site chemistry. So if we look at the top chart, in the top right of that chart, at dose of 1 at T1 and full dose of 1 at T2, then we see that we get 13 years of effective life. So that's the time from introduction of the single site fungicides until we'd expect them to lose effective control. And what you can also see is if we were to lower the dose of those single site fungicides, then we get more years of effective control. So resistance takes longer to build. And then if we look at the UK and EU treatment program below, where we just have methane in the T1 position, this is relatively exposed and it doesn't have a resistance partner, it doesn't have a mixture partner. So in this case, at full dose, we see that it takes 10 years here for resistance to develop such that we lose effective control. And again, if you look at the top right of that chart, the lower chart, you can see that it's 10 years, but if we were to lower the dose here, then that changes to, if we lower the dose at T2, it changes to 9 years. And that's because, as I say, methane is exposed in the T1 position here. Okay, now we're just looking at the UK treatment program, methane plus Fluxa at T1 and T2. As we saw, full doses of those single site actives at T1 and T2, we have 13 years of effective life. And then in the table below, we're looking at what happens if we were to add in folpet, either at T1 or at T2, or both T1 and T2. And here we looked at two different rates of folpet. So a full rate of 1.5 litres per hectare of Arizona, which is 750 grams active per hectare, and also a 2/3 rate, which is 1 litre per hectare or 500 grams active per hectare. So what you can see is that if we add in folpet to T1 or T2 into this program, the effective life of the single site fungicides increases from 13 years up to 16 or 17 years, depending on the dose of folpet that we added in. If we were to add in folpet at T1 and T2 in the lower row of the table, then effective life is increased from 13 years up to 21 or 27 years, depending on the folpet dose. So essentially, if we were to add in folpet at full rate, T1 and T2, then we're doubling the effective life of the single site chemistry. Okay, here we're going back to the UK treatment program, methane plus Fluxa T1 and T2. And again, here we're looking at the different rates of those single site fungicides at T1 and T2. And then what that would look like if we add in a full dose of folpet, either at T1 or at T2 or both. And essentially what we're seeing is that if we were to reduce the dose of the single site fungicides in this program, then we start to see longer effective lives. Okay, so we're looking at the EU treatment program, methane at T1, methane plus Fluxa at T2. And again, what happens if we add in folpet either at 2/3 or at full rate in the T1 position or at T2 or both. And as I mentioned, methane is relatively exposed in terms of resistance development at T1 here. So if we add in folpet at that position, then what we saw was that the effective life of methane was increased from 10 years up to 17 or 18 years. And if we add in folpet here at T2, then we see a benefit, but not as much of a benefit as if we added it in at T1. If we were to add in folpet to T1 and T2, then effective life is increased from 10 years up to 24 or 28 years, depending on the folpet dose. And that's partly because folpet is slowing the rate of resistance development, and partly because folpet is providing additional disease control when we start to see resistance development. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're fixing the dose of the single site chemistry, and we're exploring what happens if we change the dose of folpet in these treatment programs. So you can see two charts here. The one on the left is for the UK treatment program, methane plus Fluxa at T1 and T2. On the right is the treatment program, methane at T1, methane plus Fluxa at T2. And you can see that we have different colors representing different effective lives. So in each of these two charts, if we look at the bottom left, that's at 0 folpet dose. What we see, if we increase the dose of folpet to T1 and T2, we move up towards the top right of these charts, and then we start to see longer and longer effective lives. And here what we've done is started with an initial frequency of fluxopyroxide resistance of 0.5. So this is the kind of situation we might have seen a few years ago where we've already seen the start of resistance development to fluxopyroxad. And here we see up to 8 years benefit in terms of additional effective life of the single site chemistry by adding in folpet at full dose. Okay, and this is essentially the same thing, but here we've changed the initial resistance frequency of fluxopyroxad, so that's very low. And what you see here is that the effective lives going from 10 years all the way up to 28 years. So essentially, if we start resistance management, we start to include folpet in a treatment program at the moment when single site chemistry is released onto the market, then we see a much bigger beneficial impact by using resistance management right from the start, rather than waiting for resistance to develop. Okay, so the messages from this work then are that folpets can increase the effective life of the treatment program substantially, but the effective life strongly depends on how folpet is used in the treatment program. So we saw that maximizing the number of applications and the dose maximizes the beneficial effect of adding in folpet. We saw that increasing the dose of the at-risk single-site products decreases their effective life, and the beneficial impact of folpet on the effective life depends on the frequency of resistance to the single-site fungicide. So folpet is helping from day one by reducing selection. Then as selection progresses, it's helping by maintaining control. Okay, so I'd just like to acknowledge Neil Pavley at ADAS, and also Frank van den Bosch and Joe Helps, who did all the modelling work that I presented. And I'd also like to thank Andy Bailey at ADAMA, who I will pass on to now. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thanks for that, Mike. I'm Andy Bailey, fungicide technical specialist at ADAMA. And after you've heard from Mike about folpet's role in resistance management, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how and when to incorporate Arizona into spring spray programs. In terms of our recommendations. I would just say, of course, it's been a very challenging autumn and winter. So we have a big variation, regionally throughout the country, but also in terms of winter cropping. Very much anything that went in September or first week in October. There's a lot of good potential there. Things after that, varying potential. So spring fungicide programs, it's gonna very much be decisions on a field by field basis this year in terms of potential for crops. But equally, it's been wet and mild. So particularly crops that were drilled earlier, and particularly those, for example, wheats that are susceptible to septoria are carrying disease. So in order to realise potential, then we really do need to focus on spring fungicide programs. And Arizona has a role to play in both scenarios, where maybe we have reduced potential, or we're maximising the much better crops. In terms of wheat recommendations, 1 to 1.5 litres of product per hectare at T1 and T2. If you choose to go at T0, then 1 litre of product, and a reminder that it's a maximum of 3 litres of product per crop. T1 is the key timing for including Arizona in any scenario. If you choose to go once, then I would say go at T1 to protect leaf 3. A very responsive timing for a contact protectant product. T2 inclusion, though, does provide improved persistence to the program in terms of septoria control and also maintaining the green leaf area in the canopy. And I think, you know, more and more we do work every year. It's very clear that including Arizona at T1 and T2 in a programmed approach consistently provides the best results. Rate selection, you know, 1 or 1.5 at T1 and T2, very much dependent on risk. You know, these agronomic factors here, of course, in assessing in a risk-based approach. Clearly the variety, susceptibility to septoria, the drilling date, absolutely key. Location, disease levels at application, the weather, of course, and often the weather. What is the weather forecast? What fungicide has been applied previously? You know, T1. Did you do anything at T0 for septoria protection? And the partner product, of course, particularly important in terms of perhaps, you know, this year there may be some crops with maybe some reduced potential where growers are looking to go a bit lighter at T1 and then waiting to see and invest heavily at T2, waiting to see what the potential of the crop is. You know, if you're paring back fungicide input at T1, I would have said that, you know, there's a good case there for including Arizona for some insurance, because as we know, weather conditions can change very quickly. High risk scenarios, 3 litres of product per crop, so spreading that across the timings T0, T1, T2 with a litre, you know, that allows you to cover the program, or 2 lots of 1.5 at T1 and T2. Both those are good inclusion strategies in high risk crops. And I always say consider including Arizona at the first fungicide application in any crop. This is a kind of an overview of our trials data over a 5-year period from 19 to 23, where we're looking at the yield response to adding Arizona into a base program. And we've got 224 comparisons here over that period. This includes the bars in blue, where we've included Arizona in the program at T1 only, orange T2 only. The greens are where we've had it in at both timings. You know, anything above the 0, of course, is a positive yield response. So it's just giving you the big picture here of trends, and the average response over that wave chart is 0.28 tons per hectare. Now, if you split that down and look at the benefit by timing, so including at T1 only, it's 0.22 tons per hectare. At T2, 0.16, so not quite as responsive. But again, there, you know, the inclusion in a programmed approach at T1 and T2 giving the best response. That's wheat. Just to look at barley, this is offering flexible options for ramularia protection. So whether it be winter or spring crop, then T2 is the key timing for including Arizona in any scenario. 1 to 1.5 litres of product per hectare at that T2 timing. You know, in a typical 2-spray strategy. So, but we have done a lot of work looking at how to include in a 2-spray programmed approach, and we see in both winter and spring crops that applying in at T1 as well, you know, preceding the inclusion at T2, which is the critical inclusion. But if you go at T1 as well, you can see improved results. in Ramillaria protection, but also, of course, Arizona has Rhynchosporium and net blotch on the label, so including at that T1, the multi-site there will help the single site partners to control those diseases, and also there's a a resistance management piece around that as well, with including the multi-site. So very much that two spray approach, helping reduce Ramillaria expression in the crop, but also maintaining green leaf canopy, and that's a a key part of Arizona in barley. It really, when added in with the single site partners, it really does help in maintaining green leaf canopy. And I think I've got an example here. This is in spring barley. This was in Ireland on Planet. And this is very typical for including Arizona at T2 in spring barley. There's a picture of the untreated. You can see some Ramillaria symptoms there and some loss of green leaf area. A Siltra program, having an effect on Ramillaria, but very clearly, you add in there a litre of Arizona at T2, and this is typically what you can see in terms of translating through to holding green in the canopy and extending that canopy to hopefully capture sunlight, translate through to yield, and keeping Ramillaria off there, and any protection through physiological spotting, etc., improves all that. Okay, that's my piece, so thank you. I'm going to hand back to Mel for questions.
Great, thanks Andy, thank you Mike for those presentations. Right, we have a few questions, so I'm going to just bring those in front of me now, and we'll get started with these. So I think the first question I'm going to put to Mike: did you model the effect of adding the multi-site when using the at-risk product only at one timing, i.e. T1 or T2, but not both, assuming an alternative control product was used at the other timing?
Yeah, so we've done various pieces of work in the past looking at multi-site chemistry in combination with a single site fungicide, and essentially what we see is the same thing as we've seen here. So in terms of resistance management, the best thing to do is to maximize the dose of the multi-site fungicide, folpet, and to minimize the dose of the single site fungicide because it's at risk of resistance development.
Great, thank you, Mike. Next, so Mike has talked about how Arizona can protect Revastar. What about how it can protect other at-risk fungicides like Univoc and Vimoy?
Yeah, so a lot of the work we do in understanding fungicide resistance is retrospective, because we look at cases where resistance has occurred and we work on those cases. But what we learn through that work are general principles that we can apply to new single site chemistry as it comes onto the market. So we'd expect to see exactly the same thing. We'd expect to see exactly the same benefits of folpet. So the same approach of maximizing folpet dose, minimizing the dose of new single site inhibitors will be the best course of action for prolonging those new single site fungicides on the market.
And I guess this sort of links to that last question. You've partly answered this already, but are we intending on doing any further work, further modelling work with other fungicides? And maybe Andy can chip in on that one too, perhaps.
Yeah, so we don't currently have plans to do that, but of course we like to explore new chemistry and other crops and diseases as well, where we'd expect to see exactly the same benefits of folpet.
I think maybe if I just add in, I think at ADAMA we're always keen to kind of look at the logical next step in this type of predictive modeling work, and what perhaps we could do to include different parameters in that integrated approach. So that may or may not include other chemistries or other parameters in resistance management. So I think we would hope to take this further and conduct this work with Mike and his colleagues, and we'll share that when it's available.
Okay, so I think now more of the questions are more around Arizona use and the season. So Andy, this one's for you. Given the difficult season, growers might be reticent to invest in an additional layer of crop protection. With this in mind, what sort of return on investment does Arizona deliver above and beyond simply delaying the resistance to single site partners?
Well, I think as I showed in in some of the data I shared, Arizona is obviously, as Mike has said, about offers resistance management, but it also offers addition to disease control, and we call it a boosting effect in terms of septoria control and extending greenleaf canopies. I think it's you can, there's evidence of this, and you see this in both wheat and barley, and so I also think that where people are dealing with crops this year that possibly have some reduced potential, and they may be thinking of cutting inputs back, including Arizona, there will give some insurance. In terms of adding efficacy and covering its costs, so it's kind of paying for itself and more. But we certainly see good return on investment. I mean, I presented the the summaries for wheat. So yeah, it's not just all about resistance management. It's clearly, in order to perform resistance management, it's adding disease control, efficacy, and also boosting and extending those greenleaf canopies. And particularly in wheat, that is really important to have greenleaf canopy to capture available sunlight to translate through to yield.
Thank you. So next, looking at how recent weather patterns have been and how quickly diseases such as septoria are developing, would you suggest that a T0 application may become more important over time?
It's an interesting question. I think certainly we're seeing some warmer, wetter winters. We certainly have recently. I think I'm a supporter of doing something at T0 for septoria management in high risk scenarios. And for example, this year we where we've seen September sown or early October sown crops of susceptible varieties, there's a lot of septoria overwintered because it's been wet and it's been mild, and laying down some protection there on leaf 4 is a good way to go. I know this splits opinion in terms of the financial returns, but I think we've also seen difficult periods of weather around T1, and if you're growing a susceptible variety, and you don't do anything for septoria at T0, then the timing of your fungicide at T1 is really has to be optimized on leaf 3. So there is a slight insurance piece around that as well. So including a multi-site at T0 for septoria management in high risk scenarios, I believe is a good way to go, and we do see a good response from that 3 lots of 1 in a program in high risk scenarios.
Great, thank you. Final question now around barley. So there's likely to be more spring barley in the ground this season. Can you elaborate on your spring barley recommendations? If there are any more specifics or anything else you can give to for best use in barley?
Well, I think I talked about inclusion of Arizona in typical 2 spray program strategies. You know, definitely including the key timing of T2 in with partners for ramillaria protection and that greening of the canopy. We do see, depending on the crop, we do see a benefit in 2 spray programs, whether that be T1, T2, or we've also looked at including Arizona, you know, maybe at a kind of a T1.5 timing and a T2, and then also delaying, putting a split on a little bit later. But the key for me is T2. But I think yeah, the inclusion there in spring barley will, you know, crucially protect against ramillaria and maintain green leaf area in the canopy.
That's great, thank you. So that's all the questions. Thanks very much for listening to the webinar today. Thank you to Andy and thank you to Mike for your presentations. You can see there's a basis point on the screen. And that's the end of today's session. So thanks again. Bye.